Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Today we're going to be looking at one of the most fascinating and dare I say even heroic women in American history and in African American history, and that is Harriet Jacobs. And Chris, when you read her story and as we discuss her story on this episode of the podcast, her story is, I find it to be not just simply dramatic for her and everything like that, but also so typical of the challenges that slave women faced in dealing with male masters and also dealing with inheritance, being inherited down to somebody's children or niece or what have you.
And what's really fascinating about this is that it is very emotional. It's very powerful for anyone that reads any of her works. And the fact is that one of her works, the one we'll look at today, her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is basically one of those pieces of American literature that I dare say should be read by anyone who really wants a good understanding of what life was like for individuals who were enslaved, but also looking at it from the aspect of that life, but those who were in control of those who were enslaved.
Yeah. And she has a North Carolina tie because that's where she was born. She was born in Edenton, North Carolina. And so I'm going to show my ignorance, Chris. That's up toward the coast, right?
Yeah, it's actually north east, if you will. You go. I grew up in Chesapeake, Virginia, and I was about an hour from Edenton, so it's about at the tip, North Carolina,
Yeah.
Virginia. You're getting right there when you get into Edenton. Beautiful lake that's up there called Arrowhead Lake. It's beautiful, beautiful place. And, yes, she was born as a slave in Edenton, North Carolina in 1813. And what is interesting is that she was the daughter of two enslaved people who were owned by different masters. And that kind of sets the stage for her in her life as she deals with some of the just atrocities that she and others will experience in her life.
Yeah. And of course, if some of our listeners aren't aware, um, what determined whether somebody was a slave was who their mom was. So your dad could be free, could be a free black. Your dad could be a free white. Your dad could be an enslaved black. Your dad could be a white indentured servant. It didn't make any difference who your father was. The the most important thing as far as your status was concerned was who your mom was. So because Harriet Jacobs' mom was a slave, she is born a slave. So when she takes her first breath, when Harriet Jacobs takes her first breath in Edenton, North Carolina, she is taking that first breath as an enslaved person, as someone who is not free.
And what's interesting is the story of her maternal grandmother, who was Molly Horniblow. And it's interesting is that during the American Revolution, you know, Harriet's grandmother was emancipated. She was freed by her mistress during the American Revolution. However, because of some things that took place, she was sold back into slavery as like a prize of war. And then in 1828, she was re-emancipated. And so you just see the struggles that these individuals faced. You would be free, and then you could be sold back into slavery, and then you could find freedom again. And imagine the emotional toil that that would take, not just on that particular individual, but grandmother to mother to daughter. It's so difficult to hear these stories and to try to imagine what they endured.
Yeah, and that's a lot of that is due to, of course, in the Constitution, what is often referred to as the Fugitive Slave Clause. And then, of course, in 1850, the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, the Fugitive Slave Law. I believe that was signed as part of the Compromise of 1850 by President Millard Fillmore. And basically, it was the idea that if there was someone who was claimed to be a runaway slave. White slave hunters from the South could capture that person and take them down south and re-enslave them, or sometimes even enslave them for the first time because they would grab someone who was born free in the North, and then that person would be literally kidnapped, taken down to the South, and enslaved. So it was a very, very bad time to be a black person in the colonies. And then, of course, during this time, 1813, to write it right up to the Civil War period, to be a black person in the states themselves. One of the things when you talk about the Underground Railroad and all that was going on there, they didn't try to take people to the North because of the fugitive slave law, because of these fugitive slave hunters. They always tried to get them out of the country into Canada because that's where freedom was.
Yeah, and this constant struggle. I remember Harriet was a young person. She had kind of moved from place to place to place just due to specific things that were happening. And I remember that she found herself the object of a particular doctor in Edenton. And this doctor, who was a white plantation, white owner, slave owner, white individual, was trying to take her as his own. And so he would try to force himself onto her, make all these unwanted advances. And she was very creative in trying to stay away, not put herself in a situation where she would find, being in a bad spot with him. But what was also interesting is that the wife of this Dr. Norcom was really jealous of Harriet because her husband was so enamored by Harriet and continued to try to do so many things. And what that basically happens is, she finds herself running from this doctor. And then she ultimately is, I guess the word would be, seduced by one of the local lawyers in town. And they get they have two children. She has two children by them when she is 16 years of age. So she's at 16 when she finds herself having a son whose name was Joseph, and then later on a child who was a daughter whose name was Louisa. And what is fascinating with this is that Dr. Norcom becomes so upset. He is just furious that Harriet has found herself in a relationship with another guy that is not his. And so she is basically sent to a plantation, and he wants to break her in. He is mad at her. He is upset. And so tries to break her in as to a field hand. And before that basically happens, she runs away and starts spending time kind of hiding. And I think it's like 7 years. Is that right?
Yeah.
That she is hiding like under like the front porch,
In a
under.
crawl space in the attic.
Yeah, okay. So just basically trying to stay away from this guy. And then, she gets creative and she writes a letter to Dr. Norcom and says, "Hey, just let you know, I'm gone. I'm up in the north. The north is great. It's free. You can't get me, but there's a problem with that. And that is that while she has been running and while she has been doing all of these things, um, her children are still with the doctor." And she writes down and says, "I'm in the north. I'd like for you to please send me my children." And of course, that never happens. And then eventually she does. I think in 1842, she leaves Edenton to try to get away from all of the things that are going on.
And she does get, at least I believe it was her daughter. She does meet back up with her daughter, but that's not through Dr. Norcom, as you said. Dr. Norcom was angry and determined to have Harriet Jacobs all to himself. But the father, the biological father of Harriet two children, the lawyer, um, whatever you may think of him as far as his behavior with Harriet, who is what, 15 years old or something at the time, he was instrumental in getting Louisa and Harriet back together. at a later date. I'm not sure what happened to her son. Do you know?
I couldn't read anything that was talking about what actually happened to her son.
And I'll tell you, there's a part of the story that I wanted to get to, and it's sort of we have to sort of go back into the story because it reminded me of another situation, and that was when Dr. Norcom was pursuing Harriet, if we could put it that way. And you talked about how his wife got jealous. One of the things he did is he went about 4 or 5 miles down the road from their home and built a cottage for his mistress or his wannabe mistress, which was Harriet Jacobs, for her to live in. And I assume the purpose of that cottage was, he thought anyway, that they were going to be able to have, relations or whatever at that particular cottage. I don't know if Chris, I don't know if you read it, and I don't know if our listeners have read it, but I would definitely encourage people to read not just simply Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, but also a book by Dr. Melton McLaurin. It's called Celia, a Slave. Have you ever read that book, Chris? It is a little book. It's not a thick book. It's not a long read. It's not a hard read, but it's about a young lady named Celia. And I'm not going to give any spoilers here, but in some ways, her situation and Harriet Jacobs' situation are mirrors of each other in some ways. In Celia's situation, she is put in a shed as well, or is in a barn or a cottage or whatever you want to call it, for the same purposes. And I think both Celia and Harriet show in the way they were treated by Dr. Norcom, by the way Harriet was treated by Dr. Norcom and Celia was treated by her slaveholder. I think they both show the how bad it was for slaves, because neither one of these women had legal recourse against what was happening to them. If they had gone to the courts, there really wasn't much the courts were going to do for them. So they were really, you talk about Harriet, hiding in the attic, or that small portion of the attic, and as far as we know, maybe losing touch with her son and all of this and all of that. There was nothing she could do. It was a situation where she was not free. She was not free in life. She was not free to make choices about herself. She was not free to make choices about her family. So, in order to get the freedom to make those choices, she had to take extreme action. Which, Chris, you know a lot about this situation as far as chattel slavery and stuff in the States as well. And slaves would be very creative in going about rebelling just enough to get some freedom.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about go back to the doctor, because that cause leads to her writing the book,
Yeah.
that he doesn't just pursue her for a year. This is not just for 2 years. He pursues her for 25 years.
Mhm.
He cannot, and this is why when you talk about the wife being jealous, because he builds a plantation, a home, he does that. He is trying, even though she has left and goes to a place called New Bedford, even though she has gone, I mean, away. For 25 years, he is continuing to try to re-enslave her. And finally, in 1852, she is receives her freedom. They pay for her freedom. And so what is happening is she is finding herself moving from place to place to place. And she becomes active in a group of anti-slavery feminists who kind of bring her in. And they start saying, listen, the only way you're going to stop this man from continuing to come after you is you need to let people know what is happening. You need to share the struggles that you are facing. And so they encourage her to write a book, and to write this book that gives graphic detail about the continued efforts of the former owners and them continuing to try to re-enslave her. And so she writes this book, Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl. And what happens is when people start reading what she writes, it shocks the American public. I mean, they are just blown away that this young lady has experienced all that she has experienced. And it's hard to get that book published because there's a lot of people that don't want to publish it because of fear of backlash and different things like that. But when she starts sharing that book, people begin paying notice, and there is more of an anti-slavery approach that begins to go on because of the incidents that she experiences that she shares with the public about.
Yes, and this is going to be one of those books, one of those publications that as you walk toward 1860 and the Civil War and the close of the antebellum period, this is going to be one of those books, one of those documents that people in the South don't want being mailed into the South, don't want being sold into the South because it exposed what was really going on. You know, there was this sort of idea presented, at least on the surface, maybe that slaves were happy and they were well treated. And Harriet Jacobs' book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, show that to be a lie. That was not true. Now, she does say in her early years that they lived a good life when she was a small child, but she makes clear that was not because of her situation, that was because of her mother. And her mother shielded her from the realities that she was growing up in.
And I think that goes to show that for those who were able to escape the injustice and the oppression and all that was being experienced, it is the power of a movement of individuals who understood that they might not be saved, but were willing to sacrifice whatever they could, even their own lives, so that others could be saved.
Yeah.
And to move her from, you mentioned the Underground Railroad, to go from point A to point B to point C was designed so that the story could be told. Tell the story of what happened, what is happening, so that others will hear. I go back to um, the Hamilton, the Broadway show Hamilton, and it just talks about the importance of Washington needing to tell his story, of Hamilton telling his story. And that's what history is all about. History is really all about his story and her story. And I go back and, Ray, we are becoming a generation or a society that does not like to read. We want 30-second snippets. We just give me the facts. I don't really care about all of those other things. But if we were to take time and really read even an old book like Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, I think it would humble us to recognize that what we experience in life is difficult. It's hard, but it does nowhere near compare to the struggles that individuals faced, especially enslaved people during this time, but how they never gave up. They fought, they worked. And what is great about Harriet Jacobs is she actually makes her way back to Edenton. She goes back home, if you will. And when she goes back home, she does some relief work. She does trying to actually, I think she established an orphanage in Savannah, Georgia, that she went back to the South. She went back to where for 25 years a man had tried to abuse her, persecute her, and would not stop. She went back home to pay back to those people a chance for hope and a chance for success and ultimately a chance for freedom. And so I do think that that speaks to the mentality and the vitality of individuals and how they never stopped believing in their cause.
Well,
But I do think that this is, I encourage our listeners to just take a minute. There's some good information out there about Harriet Jacobs. It is a life well worth studied and to be remembered. However, it's also a life that has mostly been forgotten and it needs to be resurrected because she truly is a phenomenal person to study. So I appreciate all of our listeners and for listening to this podcast, listening to all of our other podcasts. You can find us all throughout social media. There's many different places you can find. We invite you to check out our YouTube, where you can find every single recording that has been made for History You Didn't Know But Should, but also through Spotify and through those other channels. And Ray, we always encourage our listeners to leave a comment, to leave some feedback on those social media channels that just let us know that, hey, I like what you guys doing, or love to hear you talk about this or that. Those things would mean a lot to us. So please take a minute to listen. We thank you for being a great listener, but also would you take a minute and just give us some feedback? We would greatly appreciate it.